Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 81 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Nalo Hopkinson, author of novels such as Brown Girl in the Ring, Midnight Robber, The Salt Roads, and The New Moon's Arms. She was born in Jamaica and has lived in Guyana, Trinidad, and Canada. Her short story collection Skinfolk was named one of the New York Times Best Books of the Year. Her latest novel, Sister Mine, is about a pair of twin sisters living in present-day Toronto who belong to a family of godlike beings called the Celestials.
Then stick around after the interview as guest geek Matt London joins us for part 2 of our discussion on the weirdest stories ever.
Alright, so let's get to our interview. Alright, so we're here with Nalo Hopkinson. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
Okay, so your new novel is called Sister Mine, and it's about a pair of sisters, Abby and Makita. So could you just tell us a little bit about those characters and how you came up with them?
I've been trying to remember that, and I'm really not sure, but part of it is because I've always been intrigued by Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. It's from the 19th century, and it's about two sisters, one of whom saves the other from goblins. And so I wanted to write about two sisters who were very, very close, as these two were. And so I came up with Abby and Makita, who were born conjoined. They got separated at birth, and when they got separated, you know, when you separate conjoined twins, often they've been sharing some part of their body, so one gets it and the other one doesn't. So when Abby and Makita get separated, Abby gets the magic and Makita doesn't.
And they belong to this family of demigods called the Celestials. And are those drawn from folklore, or did you just make them up? Where did those characters come from?
The characters are kind of a riff on the deities from the Afro-Caribbean belief system, which is rooted in West Africa, and you see various versions of it throughout the African diaspora, wherever African people landed up, West African people specifically. So they are sort of based on them. Beyond that, I departed a bit and had a bit of fun and used a bit of imagination, but they're very clearly, people would be able to identify who's who.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, could you talk a little bit about just a couple of them and maybe what sort of spins you put on those characters?
Well, I have Grandmother Ocean, who is loosely based on Oshun, who is a riverine deity. She's associated with bodies of waters, such as rivers. I made her into the grandmother of the lot and did a pun on her name so that Oshun became Ocean. I have General Gunn, who is very loosely based on Ogun, again a pun on the name. And Ogun is a blacksmith, but can also be found on the battlefield where he has a tendency to go into berserker mode. So I did a bunch of playing around with Ogun and who Ogun is as General Gunn, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And then Makita and Abby's father had fallen in love with a mortal woman, and so they're half mortal, or basically mortal. And so they're kind of on the outs with their family. And does that have a history in folklore that sort of thing might happen?
It sure has a history in science fiction and fantasy. The idea of the biracial savior of two races, or what a sweetheart of mine calls not so subtle race allegory science fiction theater. So I did some of my own, and the idea that they're on the outs of their one half of their birth family is it's the kind of thing you can see in life everywhere, where the circumstances of somebody's birth, their family doesn't approve of, and so decides that they aren't really one of them, and find subtle and not so subtle ways to keep them feeling ostracized. So I just sort of drew an human foible.
Mm-hmm. And then the magic system in this book is called Hoodoo. And is that just a variant spelling of voodoo? Is that different in any way from what people think of when they hear the word voodoo?
It is, and it isn't. They are related. Getting into the specifics of how they are and are not related could take up most of this podcast, and you need somebody with more training in it than I have. But they are definitely related. And I think I called it mojo.
Well, I think both terms appear in the book.
Yeah, I do use them. I throw in a bunch of terms, but I call magic specifically mojo.
And is there a difference between hoodoo and mojo, or is that also too complicated to get into?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, mojo feels to me like a broader word because, I mean, most of us know the blues song, I Got My Mojo Working. That sense of got game.
Okay.
Is one of the ways you'll hear people using mojo. I think hoodoo is something specific that's a specific set of practices.
Okay. Well, I mean, one example of the magic in this book that I really liked was one of the characters was once one of Jimi Hendrix's guitars, and he was turned into a human being. How did you come up with that idea?
Totally freaking randomly. I was writing, and I don't do well with outlines. I have to outline in order to be able to have a project I can sell to an editor. But once I've done the outline is always very vague, and once I've done that, I just start writing. So I was writing that scene and got to a moment where Makeda asks something about Jimi Hendrix, and the guy leans forward and says, "I used to be his guitar," and that just came out of my fingers. You know, I was just typing, and there it was. And then I thought, okay, that's cool. What? How did that happen? Did Jimi Hendrix even have a British guitar at any point? Because this guy is British. What did I just do? So then I had to do some research and figure out a bit more about Hendrix and his music and his guitars. And it also went in to inform the story. That one was completely random.
Well, it's funny. There's a part in the book where Makeda sort of zones out and creates this powerful magical artifact. And I saw a clip with you where you said that you have this tendency to sort of zone out and don't ask you how the toothpaste ended up in the refrigerator and stuff like that.
Yes.
I was just wondering, is that part of your creative process to sort of zone out and then come to and kind of look at what you've written and be like, where did this come from?
It can happen. It hasn't happened reliably for about 5 or 6 years now, partly because I spent 5 or 6 years quite ill and couldn't concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes. So zoning out in a creative way did not happen much. But I have ADD, and part of that means that sometimes you just kind of lose track, either because you're hyper-focused on one thing or because you're not focused at all and struggling to focus and sort of taking in all the information all at once and getting too confused to make any good sense of it. So I know the sense of, I have had lovely moments that feel like moments where I'm writing and I'm writing and I'm writing. I'm quite aware of what I'm doing. And then I look up and it's 4 hours later, where it feels subjectively like only a few minutes. They don't happen often enough because they're very easy, or they're not easy. Writing's never easy, but they're exciting when they happen. But I've heard other writers describe going into that kind of creative vortex where you sort of get lost in the work and everything else kind of fades away for a while. And then you look up and you're surprised almost that you're back in the world.
And I mean, a lot of the characters in this are artists or musicians and things. There's this wonderful, I think, bohemian atmosphere to the apartment complex that Makeda moves into. And I was just, I think, did you have a background in arts grants or something? I was just wondering, have you experienced that sort of environment, or is that sort of a dream life, or?
A little bit of everything. Grew up in, my dad was a poet, a playwright, an actor. A lot of his friends were writers or actors, some of them artists. So it's a world I kind of grew up in, but not like Makeda experiences it. I have been in a warehouse. I've lived in a warehouse, but it was awful and filthy, and it didn't feel bohemian so much as just really not any fun at all. So, but this is fiction, so I can make it fun. And I have, because I worked in the arts in Toronto, because I still tend to work in the arts, I'm very much used to that surround. So I was able to draw on it, and also had people I could ask for advice when, I didn't know anything about how an electric guitar works, for instance. So it's a little bit of experience, a little bit of drawing on the experience of others. And, I would love to move into a building that was never intended to be a house and make a home into it. I want to live in a fire station. I want to live in a silo. I want to live in, an old church or an old mosque, and make it my own. It's a dream. I don't know if it'll ever happen, but it's been a dream for a very, very long time.
And you mentioned that that this was sort of inspired in a way by the Christina Rossetti poem, The Goblin Market. And there are actually excerpts from that poem scattered throughout the book. I was just wondering, why did you decide to include those excerpts in here?
The poem itself is gorgeous, and it manages to simultaneously be very innocent and very sexual. It's these two sisters have such a strong love for each other that they're physically affectionate as well as just loving. And some of the lines in the poem read like sex scenes. They aren't, but they read like sex scenes. And I just couldn't help but include some of that gorgeous, gorgeous writing of Christina Rossetti's, and some of the sort of the lines that it is possible to twist and read as perverse, if you have a mind like mine.
well, no, I mean, I think the sexual subtext of the scene, particularly where the two sisters smush fruit all over and the fruit is running down.
Fruit juice off the other's body, and I'm like, yes, really?
And there's a scene very reminiscent of that in here, where the two sisters are kind of smushing oranges on each other. That was the one I noticed. Are there other scenes like that were sort of pulled out of the poem, or?
There is I don't want to give away too much, but there's stuff in that I refer to that refers back to the poem, between my two sisters that I created for the novel. And I tried to sort of evoke their closeness with the line about like two birds in one nest, where they're sleeping in the same bed. So there are a few bits where I sort of refer backhandedly to things.
Okay, and so the title of this book I saw was originally Donkey.
Yes.
And how did that change to Sister Mine?
Yeah, that was my editor. Editors get to change your titles. I mean, you have to agree, but they'll work really hard to get you to agree. And I called the novel Donkey because when the sisters were younger, one of them, Makeda, was a little more physically healthy and developed quicker than the other. And she would occasionally carry Abby on her back. And because Makeda is the one without the magic, she's grown up with this notion that the family thinks the only thing she's good for is for carrying her talented sister around. And so she thinks of herself as the donkey. And in fact, some of the other relatives think of her that way too. So that's what that came from. My editor thought that the title Donkey, though apt, was sort of ugly in what it referred to, and they didn't want to turn people off the book before they had started reading it. And I figure marketing department knows their job better than I do, so I was okay with it. The neat thing is, when I was most of the way through a first draft, I discovered a pair of sisters, Black girls who were born into slavery, Millie Christine, who were born conjoined, kind of back to back and side to side, and who became singers, where one was physically stronger than the other, and actually the weaker one would sometimes sort of kite her legs up into the air, and the stronger one would walk around with her. So I went and found, singing Black sisters where one was stronger than the other, and they were conjoined. I had not known about them before then. My friend Ellen Clagis, who's also a writer, told me about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and Makeda collects photos of conjoined twins. I guess, did you do a lot of research on conjoined twins, or did those?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Not so much on the modern day aspects of them, although there's a little bit of that there, but the way they have been treated in history is interesting to me because of how they have often ended up being put on display and having to be treated as one person. When you read references to Millie and Christine, they're called Millie Christine and referred to in the singular as though they were one person. So I did a lot of research into various types of ways that human beings can be born attached to each other. And some of them were fascinating. Mm-hmm. The whole idea of the parasitic twin, where it's not even a whole person, it's a body part that's sort of attached to the child when it is born. Just some amazing stuff our bodies can do.
Uh-huh. And you have I think it's a YA book out called Chaos, and mm-hmm. that was also, they made you change the title, right?
You've been doing your research. Yes, that one I was calling Taint, and I was getting pushed back on the title from the very beginning because of, some of the street names, what Taint means on the street. Mm-hmm. And I kind of liked that meaning. So I wanted to keep it and had tried to sort of modulate it by putting an apostrophe after the T so that it could also be kind of thing like taint no sin, mm-hmm. take off skin and dance on your bones. But in the final, when I handed in my manuscript, the editor wrote me back and said, look, my sales managers are giggling every time I do the title. Can we please change it? So I did. That whole thing of changing titles, I've learned now to have a second title in reserve. Because frequently I seem to come up with titles that make, editors' hair fall out.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, Sister Mine is very sexual, and I would imagine a book called Taint might be as well, although it's a YA book, so I think maybe, I wonder not. But I mean, is there sexuality in Chaos, and what sort of...
Yes, there is. The protagonist is 16. She is sexually active. That's barely there in the story. I mean, it's obvious that she is, but I don't make a whole lot of it. For me, part of what was going on in the Chaos is that when she was younger, before she was sexually active, she was in a different school where she was being slut-shamed by the other girls in the school. That kind of phenomenon where girls will spread rumors about each other or they'll find one of their own to pick on and spread rumors about, awful things they're doing with the football team or, and sometimes will physically attack them as well. I wanted to talk about that because it will happen irregardless of whether the girl they pick on is actually sexually active. So I have a moment where my protagonist in the Chaos remembers the other girls sort of passing around notes or something that said she'd been giving blowjobs to the whole football team. And she's at this point maybe 13. She doesn't even know what one is. She just knows it's not good. So I wanted to talk about that phenomenon and what happens to her, what happens to girls who have this visited upon them, because often they're the ones who are for some reason casted as outsider. They might be different in some way, or they might be newly come to the school when all the others know each other already. There's usually something like that going on. And I did a lot of looking into the lives of girls who had been slut-shamed.
Well, actually, I mean, one of the Amazon reviews I read, they complained specifically about that line about blowing the football team, that it was too graphic or something. Have you gotten...
Yes, I read that review. I sympathize with the reviewer. She's a woman who has two daughters of her own, and she's sort of alarmed at the notion they might be reading stuff, not even about blowjobs. I don't describe a blowjob. There's no sex on screen in the book at all. But the notion that they might be reading words like that. And she was also alarmed that my protagonist often disobeys her parents. That one made me smile. I mean, I have sympathy for the woman, but the fact is her girls may be dealing with this kind of stuff. as we speak. And they'll need to be able to come to her and tell her. They need their parents to be allies, not so afraid of the world that they won't deal with it. So I'm of two minds, and it was how I was going to write it anyway.
Mm-hmm. And then, back in episode 70, we interviewed Junot Diaz, and I asked him if he was familiar with your work. And he said, quote, "Of course, I mean, Nalo is my girl. I saw Nalo just a couple of days ago."
Yes.
So I was just kind of curious how you guys know each other and how often you hang out and stuff like that.
Well, I knew of his work because he was making such a splash for himself with his very first short story collection, Drown. I did not know him, but turned on my email one day to an email from him basically saying hi and how much he loved science fiction and how much he wanted to write it. And we kept in touch. Finally met, I can't remember the year, but he and Joe Haldeman, who both teach at MIT, engineered having me go to visit MIT. And that's when I met Juno. I'd known Joe before because Joe was a teacher at the Clarion I attended. So that's when I met Juno in the flesh. But we've kept in touch. We tend to see each other across crowded rooms where 2,000 people have gathered to hear Juno speak. And we wave. But he's a wonderful, wonderful man. I teach his work in my creative writing classes now to give the students a sense of voice and language and just fierce honesty in your writing.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah. Could you talk about you started teaching fairly recently, right, at UC Riverside?
Mm-hmm. I've been teaching all my writing career off and on, but usually one-off things like a Clarion or that kind of thing. And I mentored at Humber College in Toronto, where it was an online mentorship. But a few years ago in 2009, I was offered a position teaching creative writing, specializing in science fiction and fantasy at the University of California, Riverside. I don't think there's another job like this in the world. I mean, a lot of people teach science fiction and fantasy, but they're usually not in a creative writing department, or it's not there isn't a position created specifically for it. This university has the Eaton Collection, which I'm told is the largest science fiction archive that is open to the public. It's a glorious, glorious collection. And there are 3 profs here who are part of a research cluster, science fiction research cluster. And a lot of our work is sort of centered around the Eaton Collection. I've been to the collection and sort of touched sort of second editions of Thomas More's Utopia and first editions of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's like, for science fiction writers, it's like going to church.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that you've had health problems, and I saw you said that this job hopefully will provide you a bit of economic security. And I think some of our listeners were just sort of wondering just how you're doing. Or are you,
Oh, bless them. I love science fiction. There are ways in which this community kept me and my partner alive through some very, very bad years. And I will always acknowledge that. So thank people for asking. I'm doing a whole lot better. A regular paycheck is magic. It's a pretty decent paycheck. Still struggling with a lot of stuff. Climbing back out of a hole of not just poverty, but homelessness takes a whole lot. But I am starting to believe it's going to hang around, that the good stuff that's happening is going to hang around. My health is coming back. My creative focus is growing again. I'm making a home for myself here, not forgetting Toronto, and to keep making a home for myself there. But basically, I am now eating regularly and back on medication I need to be on and doing better and better every day.
Oh, well, that's great.
Yes.
And another book you had just come out recently was you were one of the featured authors in Terry Bisson's Outspoken Author series. Could you just talk about that series and how you got involved with it?
Report from Planet Midnight. Terry approached me. Wow. See, part of my memory's bad, partly because of the ADD and the learning disability and the fibromyalgia, but put it through then 5 years of destitution and it gets even worse. So I remember Terry approaching me. I don't remember when or how, whether it was in the flesh or whether he sent me an email, but he told me about the Outspoken Authors series that he edits, that are chapbooks, where one author is sort of featured. They will have a story or two in there, an interview with Terry, and an essay. And I said, yes, I thought I could do that. And we worked on it. Terry was very, very patient as I went through homelessness and clambered my way back out to sort of having a home, to really having a home, to being able to think about writing at all. And bless his heart, he kept waiting, and he remained patient, but kept on at me until we had Report from Planet Midnight, which it's got 2 of my short stories. I didn't have the brain to write new ones at the time, but I picked 2 that most people will not have seen because they got published in such obscure places. One of them wasn't even published as a short story, and it wasn't published under my name. And then he did the interview, and I took an address I had given to the International Conference of the Fantastic in the Arts. I was the guest author in a year where the theme of the conference was race in the literature of the fantastic. And it was about 1.5 years after Race Fail. So I knew it was going to be touchy. And I did part of the address as a performance piece that talked about translation, really about what we mean when we say I'm not racist. So all of those are in the chapbook, which I had thought, I really liked it. I really loved the work that Terry did, the editing he did, the way he put everything in context. I loved the way the book looked. I loved working with the editor and the publishing house. But since it was a chapbook, and I know particularly in this genre, we're size queens. Mm-hmm. we want, the book's not a book unless it's at least 400 pages, preferably twice that. So I figured it would be mostly of academic interest. To my surprise, people have been buying it and reading it and talking about it, and it's got legs. It's doing quite well. I'm very pleased because it's a book I really am proud of having done, and proud of the fact that Terry asked me. Terry's been an outspoken writer for a very long time, and that he thought what I had to say was important enough to be heard is a lovely thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and in this performance piece you mentioned, you actually enacted as if you were sort of channeling an alien intelligence.
Yes.
Could you talk about why you decided to present your remarks that way?
I had been trying to write. I knew almost 2 years ahead of that particular ICFA, that particular year of the conference, that I was going to be the guest author. And I had been trying to write my speech for most of that time. And you know how touchy things got around Race Fail and the kinds of stuff that was happening. And I'd start trying to write it, and I'd get a combination of scared and furious. And I'd go take a walk around the block. And plus I was, still homeless and hungry. No, by then I actually had an apartment, a room in somebody's apartment. But the words weren't coming in a way that felt strong to me, or felt like people would find them listenable. Mm-hmm. Until it was the day before the conference. I was actually already at ICFA, and I took my notes down and started going over them again. And it may have been something my partner said that made me start writing in that mode of a translator from another planet. And I was mixing all kinds of modes, because I have the translator sort of, when I did the piece, I have the translator inhabit me. So we have the very science fiction or fantasy notion of possession. But the notion of possession is also one that you find in the Afro-Caribbean spiritual systems that I talk about a lot in my writing. Only it's not a scary possession. It's not a ghost taking you over so that they can vomit out every fluid you ever had in your body. It's in the course of a religious service, You open yourself to the deity. You invite the deity, one of the deities, to come down and inhabit your body for a while so that they can talk to their parishioners. So I was evoking both simultaneously because my world is a hybrid one. My references are hybrid references. So I just really worked that. And so had this translator from another planet inhabit me as a horse, which is what you call the person in the spiritual service who has a god riding on their head. And he and his team of translators have been listening to transmissions from Earth and having to translate them, and they're not sure they're really getting them because the translations they're getting aren't really making sense to them. So he's asking for clarification. And when they tried to translate I'm not racist, they got something like, I can swim in shit without getting any of it on me. And they looked at their own translation and thought, that doesn't make any sense. What sensible race would say this? So they've come down to ask for clarification, always with a confession every so often that, sure, you guys do some crazy things. We do some crazy things too, because I didn't want to give people the notion that I was standing there from some notion of purity or being unaffected by racism. And it was a fascinating performance to give. I was shaking. Because I knew who attends ICFA, and I knew that some of the people who were there would not be fond of what I was saying. But I could also hear the support of people in the audience who did get it and were and who encouraged me. And I actually cut it short as a speech because I just couldn't go I couldn't bring myself to keep standing up there feeling as vulnerable as I did. But to my surprise, when I stopped, got a standing ovation from the audience. So Terry had me take that speech and put it in context for people who don't know science fiction community and to whom race fail would not make any sense just as a phrase. And then I put the speech in with some additions. I have forgotten your question.
Yeah, I guess the question was just about why did you choose to present as an alien being, and maybe is there some synchronicity between feelings of alienation and extraterrestrials and race relations and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, you look at science fiction and look how often it talks about being alienated about the other. Look at the numbers of blue people.
Yeah, that was funny. Yeah, you mentioned all
Avatar, I'm looking at you. And it is now easier to find people of color in science fiction literature and media, but the issues of representation are still really, really troubling. The way they took, for instance, Avatar: The Last Airbender, that was a pan-Asian world and made the protagonist white. Neil Gaiman talking about, I believe it's either Nancy Boys or American Gods, getting an offer for a film production of it and then having the producers say, well, of course we're going to make everyone white because black people aren't interested in fantasy, so he pulled it. The kind of thing you'll hear white writers say about not wanting to write any people of color for one reason or another, but it all boils down to because I don't want people to be mad at me. So the issues are still very, very much there. Even though we talk about race a lot in the literature, there's still this idea of, well, if we make this person blue and give them pointy ears, then we don't have to actually talk about what's happening in the real world. And those of us who live in racialized bodies feel that lack. We feel that erasure. So yes, there was something quite deliberate in my doing half the speech as an alien.
I mean, I think actually a lot of our listeners probably don't know what race fail was. So do you want to maybe just explain that for them?
Yes. I believe in 2009, discussions on race and racism in science fiction and fantasy literature and community blew the hell up on the internet. There are some 10,000 posts that have been archived with people of color in the community talking about what our experience has been, with white people in the community talking about what their experience has been, with lots of people who are very proud to say that they're colorblind, opining very loudly on why the people of color were talking nonsense. It just got very productive. And I use that word deliberately because a lot of good came out of it. For one thing, people of color began to see that we made contact with each other. Often you go to a con and it can still happen that you're the only or one of a handful of people of color there. When Octavia Butler was alive, it was the experience of all the other maybe 4 Black women science fiction writers in the community that we would go to a con and someone would assume that that's who we were, to the point where Toby Backel suggested we call ourselves the Butlerian Jihad. I want T-shirts. So a lot of the buried and not so buried systemic racism in science fiction community became laid bare. Lots of people denied it was there, but how could it not be? We are part of the rest of the world. Like I said, you can't, swim in shit and not get any of it on you. This idea that the worst thing that could happen to you is for somebody to say that was racist and that you should react virulently against the very notion that you can be affected by your own society. People began to talk about that, and people began to make space to talk about it. And one of the lovely, lovely things that came out of it was a publishing venture that's going quite well and got supported by community beautifully. And out of it came the sort of the 50 books challenge, where a lot of the readers realized that they weren't reading writers of color and started challenging each other to read 50 books by writers of color in a year. And they're doing it. It's a lovely thing. There's still this notion that you are somehow morally superior if you don't know anything about the background of the writers you read. And I maintain that writers have every right to not talk about their backgrounds. That's fine. But when people do, and it's important to their work, to not know doesn't mean you're morally superior. It means that you are indifferent. And so there's just all of that going on, still getting challenged, still arguments going back and forth. It's a very rich time, I think, in science fiction community, and a lot of nastiness has come out of it, but a lot of change, I think, is beginning to come out of it, and it's at base a hopeful time for me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if people want to embark on that 50 book challenge you mentioned, do you have what would be some of the 5 or 6 that they should start with that you would really recommend?
Oh my God. You want me to get hate mail? 5 or 6? Okay, let's start with one on my desk. The Best of All Possible Worlds by Karen Lord. It's her new one. I'm reading it now and really enjoying it. Something I'm teaching my students. Thomas King, Green Grass Running Water, Canadian First Nations author. That's 2, Samuel R. Delaney, Pretty Much Anything. That's 3, 100,000 Kingdoms by Nora Jemison. Charles Saunders, Pretty Much Anything. And Love and Rockets, which is a graphic novels, comics, as well as Bayou, which is another set of graphic novels. There, off the top of my head.
Who is Love and Rockets by?
Love and Rockets is by the Hernandez brothers. Bayou is by Jeremy Love.
Uh-huh. Actually, speaking of graphic novels, I saw you say that you were very slowly working on a graphic novel. Was that, is there any status? Progress, yeah.
No, but I'm still collecting research. It's something that my life partner and I were working on together, and he's gone back to school, so it's on hiatus. Uh-huh. But I'm still collecting research and notes for it. I don't know when it'll happen. It's nowhere near imminent.
Can you say what you're researching or sort of what the overall topic is? Or
part of what we're looking at is discussions of what constitutes a human being at a time between sort of the Second World War and a few years afterwards, where we had the suffragist movement, where women were fighting to be recognized as people. We had corporations being designated people under the law, that kind of thing. But I'm also looking at a particular African supernatural creature and the history of Black men on the railroad in North America. I can't do just one thing, right? It all comes together, I promise you, but I just don't know when.
Okay, so that pretty much does it for the questions. I'm just wondering, I guess, finally, are there any other projects that you're working on or have coming up that we haven't touched on yet?
Yes, I am back to working on Blackheart Man, which is a novel that I mostly finished and had to put aside. So I'll be working on that over the summer. I am shopping around a new short story collection and just generally getting about the business of learning to become a full-time professor and getting back into my creative brain. So that's where I'm at.
All right, great. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Nalo Hopkinson, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thank you.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Nalo Hopkinson for joining us on the show. And as we mentioned for our panel today, we'll be having part 2 of our discussion of the weirdest stories ever. So basically what happened is that back in episode 79, we talked about the weirdest stories ever, but then we sort of ran out of time and barely got to mention any of the movies we wanted to talk about. So we thought we'd do a little follow-up panel specifically devoted to weird movies and video games. And we're joined by a special guest geek, Matt London. He's a graduate of the Clarion Writers Workshop and the New York University School of Film and Television. He's written about film, video games, and other stuff for Tor.com, Lightspeed, and Realms of Fantasy. He's also the creator of the animated web series Space Pirates in Space, which you can watch now at spacepiratesinSpace.com. So Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys. Always happy to be here.
And so I think, first of all, we're just going to talk about what are the weirdest movies we've seen lately. And I just watched a really weird movie last night called Kill List. Another weird movie I saw recently was John Dies at the End. Have you guys seen either of those?
I have not.
Neither have I. So tell us all about it.
All right. Well, okay. So Kill List is about these two guys, and they were former soldiers, and now they're working as contract killers. And each person that they're hired to kill, right before the main character kills them, says, "Thank you." And it's really, really creepy. And it just gets super, super weird. And I don't want to say too much about it. But actually, both this movie and John Dies at the End start out really cool. And then sort of toward the end, I was kind of exasperated because it's sort of not making any sense. And when the movie's over, you're kind of like, wait, that's the end. But then when I think about it afterward, I'm kind of like, that was actually kind of cool. So I don't know. That seems to be a quality of weird movies, is that oftentimes I enjoy thinking about them afterward more than actually watching them. I don't know. Do you guys find anything? Do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, I think when you have a really bizarre movie where either you don't quite understand what happened at the end, or something about it was just so strange, unsettling, or puzzling that, you know, you never forget it. It stays with you because you're still trying to puzzle it out long after the curtains roll, long after the credits roll.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like a lot of these movies, they don't actually make sense, and so you can sort of keep thinking about them forever and never actually figure it out, right? Because there actually is nothing to figure out.
Right.
There's two ways to look at that, right? I mean, some movies are like puzzle boxes, and you watch them thinking you understand what's happening, and then you get to the end and you realize that you don't understand anything that happened. but there is some revelation at the end of the movie that makes you go, oh, if I watched this film again, so much of it would make more sense. You know, I think about movies like The Usual Suspects or Memento as examples of that. Movies that make you go, oh, and then you see all the clues, you know, before. And then there's others that are deliberately ambiguous, either because they are missing scenes or they were meant to be incoherent. And, you know, I think that there are good and bad examples of both. With the former, you have movies that's like, oh, well, you just manipulated me into thinking that I was watching one movie, but instead I was watching this other movie, and I've seen this twist 100 times before, and it no longer has any meaning for me. You know, I think about, what is that movie called? The Window or The Single Window, something with, it had Johnny Depp and, John Turturro.
Secret Window?
The Secret Window, right. Oh, that movie made me so mad. Because it was just like, come on. You're like doing an impression of a better movie. Like, why are you copying other movies?
But yeah, when you were saying like that some movies just seem weird because there are parts missing from them, that made me think of Twin Peaks, was it? Mm-hmm. Where, no, wait, what was there was one, it was planned out as a TV series and they couldn't make it as a TV series, so they just
Mulholland Drive.
Okay,
Let's talk about Mulholland Drive, because I think that is a great example of the second thing that I was talking about, which is movies where, yes, it was meant to be a TV series. They didn't finish filming, like, individual episodes of the series. And so when you watch it, it's totally incoherent. But I think that once you make the choice that this is going to be a movie, you can either fill in the gaps that make it totally incoherent, or just say, you know what, I'm going to just make this movie totally incoherent. And let the audience, you know, extract the meaning that they want to from it.
Well, David Lynch is always going to choose incoherence.
Yeah, well, there's one where there's just this, like, monstrous homeless guy behind a dumpster. And, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that's in Mulholland Drive.
Oh, is it? Okay, and I watched I swear I watched the director commentary on, or something. And the guy was like, why'd you put this monstrous homeless guy behind this dumpster? And he's like, I don't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do.
It was such a weird scene. Because it's this weird, it's like a conversation in a diner with these two guys. And then they walk outside and there's like terrifying homeless guy. Inexplicably.
I mean, you can basically say that's just like the weirdest scene about almost every scene in every David Lynch movie. Like, I remember somebody recommending Eraserhead to me, which was, I guess, David Lynch's first movie, or at least his first major film, if not his first. But I got it, and I was just like, I don't understand how you could recommend this to me without preparing me for what it is, because it's like such a bizarre film, and truly one of the weirdest things I've ever witnessed. You know, and again, having anyone who saw a David Lynch movie that then hired him to adapt Dune just seems like such a strange choice. It's like, I mean, let's take a really complicated, like, you know, science fictional history that is not actually particularly weird and hire the weirdest director ever to direct it. Although, wasn't he also in discussions to do one of the Star Wars movies or something?
Yeah, I mean, that's what happens when you have an independent director who gets really hot really fast, has one breakout movie. Hollywood descends on that person and tries to make them do everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like Darren Aronofsky, actually. That happened to him.
Right. There's a gazillion examples of people like that who start off with, you know, this one personal, interesting movie, and then Hollywood throws a million different kind of like the kind of scripts that are for movies that you wouldn't necessarily want to go see, really generic stuff. You know, and then their career doesn't go anywhere. It totally stagnates because whatever the next project is totally lacks the personal importance and the passion that their debut had.
Well, I wanted to talk about Pi, you know, Darren Aronofsky's first movie, because, you know, back in part one of this, I mentioned Stephen King's Ballad of the Flexible Bullet, which more than any other short story has made me feel like I was going insane when I was reading it. And for me, Pi is the filmic equivalent of that. Like, no movie I've ever watched that I can think of made me feel like I was going insane as I was watching it, as that one did.
Oh, and what a great movie that is, man. Like, I just got chills when you were talking about it because I was just thinking about it again. And I remember when I first watched that like, in college, and it was just sort of like a random discovery. And man, like, what a powerful movie that is. And yeah, it's really, really weird. It's weird in that way where, like, when Matt was talking about, like, you could actually watch it again and again, and you can sort of start to piece more together about what's happening and what's going on and all this weirdness. Whereas a lot of these movies where they're just weird, they're just weird for weirdness' sake without actually having any rhyme or reason to them. But Pi, I feel like we could probably figure it out if we watched it enough times and like, had the right brain to figure it out. I mean, I'm not sure that I have that brain, but I'm sure somebody knows what it's about somewhere.
I've certainly experienced that phenomenon as well, like, particularly with Pi, watching it several times and sort of being able to figure out more and more each time you watch it. God, there's so many weird things in that movie, like the brain that he finds on the subway steps and like that bizarre guy on the subway who talks to him. He's like being chased by the government or some like world bank. And then, like, he gets kidnapped by rabbis at one point.
Yeah. And, like, I mean, even just his computer that he has in his apartment, and he finds, like, the weird sticky stuff on it or whatever, and, like, he doesn't know what's going on, and it's like, what is happening here? Is, like, the computer becoming alive, or what's happening, and it's just so strange.
I mean, I remember Pi as being also a unusually short movie. Am I remembering that right?
No, it's about 80 minutes long. It's very short.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times weirdness is more effective at a shorter length, and a lot of times these movies spin out of control because they're trying to stretch them out to an hour and a half, 2 hours, and like probably I didn't actually watch it, but I suspect that Richard Kelly's adaptation of Button, what was that called?
I think it was just called Button, wasn't it?
The Button, the box,
the box, yeah,
the box, yes.
Like everyone said that it was just it was a good idea for a half-hour Twilight Zone adaptation, which is what it was originally. Yeah. Stretched out into a feature film. It had no business being stretched out into a feature film.
But actually, yeah, speaking of people who started off with a cool indie debut and then went on to produce like horrible commercial crap. But yeah, Richard Kelly, holy crap. I mean, he directed Donnie Darko, and that was his debut, and it was like, oh wow, what a weird, cool movie, and like, really, really seemed like it had depth to it, and it was something that would reward watching over and over, and then he went on to, and was Southland Tales his next movie? Like, what a piece of shit that was. Like, well, I don't know what the fuck is happening in that movie.
Well, I want to talk about like Donnie Darko because I love that movie. I've watched it probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 times. And that's a movie, like I was saying with David Lynch, that you should not watch the director commentary. And I think we've talked about this before, but it you have all these interesting theories for what this stuff means, and then you watch the director commentary, and you're just like, oh my god, this is so dumb.
Well, actually, I was going to say you also should not watch the director's cut. Apparently, from what I've heard, I haven't actually watched it, but I've heard that it ruins the movie.
The director's commentary for Donnie Darko is kind of similar to the extended editions of the Lord of the Rings movies. In both cases, there's some stuff that you're like, oh, you took this out for time and it's so interesting and wouldn't it have been great if this was in the movie? But then there's other stuff that you're just like, oh my goodness, why would you ever put this in the movie?
Yeah.
Why is this here? I think the biggest mistakes with the Donnie Darko director's cut were all of the sort of like text-based cutaways. There are these weird asides where literally in a title crawl, they explain what's going on in the movie. And it's just like, it ruins the movie. Cause what people like about that movie is the way it makes them, that weird way it makes them feel. And you're like, everything about this is so strange and creepy and I can't figure out what's going on and I get covered in goosebumps whenever I see that skull bunny. Like, that's what you love about the movie. But once you see the director's cut, it's like, there's no mystery. They tell you, written down, what that blue thing is bursting out of his chest. They tell you what's going on with the weird cuts in time. They explain all of that, and it totally takes away the magic of the movie.
I think that's a reason why directors, even writers, any creator, when they're being asked about their work, they need to be really careful about the answers they give, because that really can take away a lot of the magic out of it. Because actually, I think you and I, Dave, went to go see Moon together, right? Mm-hmm. And when we went to see it, Duncan Jones, the director, was there, and he answered some questions, and it was like, dude, you need to think about what you're going to say before you answer these questions, because what you just said, that's stupid as hell, and just ruined the movie for a lot of people. I was already sort of dissatisfied with it by the time, the movie was over, but if I had been liking it and then he had said the stupid shit that he said, I would have been like, what? You know? And I don't even want to repeat it just in case anyone likes that movie, because it was like really so ridiculous that it's like you just don't even want to know.
I think about it sometimes in terms of like mystery versus ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And that the sort of the smell test that you can apply is what's being planted in a scene mysterious, which is it's teasing something that you could figure out if you really put your mind to it, and stuff that's, you know, deliberately vague and inexplicable, and if you really broke it down, contradicts something else in the story.
Well, I mean, we kind of got off the subject of what weird movies we've watched lately. Did you guys have any of those that you wanted to mention?
Oh, right. Yeah, no, when you mentioned that, I was gonna mention Beasts of the Southern Wild, which I mean has been getting a lot of attention lately. It was just up for the Oscar. The director was nominated, and the star was up for Best Actress, and there was a lot of other nominations for it. But it is actually a really weird movie. It sort of takes place in I believe like in the area of Louisiana or something, and it's like. But it's like in this really poor area, and it's about this girl and her father like living in this like, I mean, it's just like very ramshackle sort of home, and it almost seems like it takes place in a magical realm elsewhere. It's so divorced from reality, and I mean, and there is some sort of genre elements into it that sort of add to the weirdness. There's like this whole thing with the aurochs, which is like this sort of ancient type of ox type creature. Yeah, no, it's a very strange movie. It's very, very excellent, though. I mean, I really enjoyed watching it, and I mean, I think it is something that would probably hold up to repeat viewings or benefit from repeat viewings.
I haven't seen any like new weird movies recently, but I recently watched the original Wicker Man, and I find that movie very strange. I think that, you know, it's funny because it's sort of a detective story that halfway through it you realize isn't a detective story. It's something totally different. And I think that the sort of detective story mystery is a nice way of getting into something bizarre. You know, you think about Blue Velvet. He's basically trying to solve a mystery, which is what sort of sends him into this bizarre world. And same with Pi. You know, there's a lot of movies like this that have this like superficial objective that the protagonist is trying to accomplish, but as you go further down the rabbit hole, you realize that the answers to those questions, you know, that you realize that you were asking the wrong questions, and that the movie ends up being about something totally different.
I mean, do you guys have movies that have sort of haunted you for years that you still don't get them? I mean, because there's this movie I watched in college called The Deceiver. I don't know how many people have seen this with Tim. Okay, so the premise is that Tim Roth is this super genius, and he's suspected of murdering a prostitute. And so these two detectives are interrogating him, and he's hooked up to a polygraph machine. But it turns out that he's so smart, and he's conditioned himself to be immune to a polygraph machine. And he sort of turns the tables on them and starts questioning them. And it turns out he knows their dark secrets and stuff. And it's just really spooky and weird. And it's one of these movies where you get to the end and I'm like, I have no idea what just happened. And I've always wanted to go back. I'm like, maybe now that I'm older, maybe I could figure out what this movie's about. Although I suspect that it's one of these movies that doesn't really make sense. But just for like, you know, over a decade now, it's sort of at the back of my mind. I've been like, I should go back and watch that and see if I can figure it out now.
There were all of these really interesting things set up in the second Matrix movie where like you didn't know where these, like, there were vampires and werewolves, and there was that bizarre scene with the architect where you didn't really know what was happening, and then Agent Smith got downloaded into that guy in that real world, and it was really ambiguous whether, like, the outside the Matrix was actually inside another Matrix, and there were all these really cool fan theories about that. I wish that they'd made a third movie that would, like, explain some of that stuff. So I sometimes wonder, like, gosh, what was The Matrix really about?
Actually, you know, I don't know that I would say it's haunted me or anything, but there is this sort of, I don't remember how good this movie actually is, but there's a movie called Cube. Did you guys see this?
Oh yeah.
So that's a really weird movie. So it's like a science fiction thing where these 4 people, I think it was 4, but there's these people that wake up in this weird environment, and it appears to be like they were captured by aliens or whatever, and put in this. It's like a torture chamber, and they have to figure out how to get from room to room in this giant cube, and it's very strange, and there's like all these traps in all the different rooms, and yeah, and like I remember getting to the end of it and then trying to puzzle out what we were actually supposed to take from it, but I can't remember if it was because it was actually weird and kind of potentially profound, or if it was just that like I saw it when I was so young that I just didn't quite know how to process it and I didn't get it.
The guy who did it was like it was like his first movie, right? He was like an indie guy who made his own film.
I really don't know much about it. The director's name is Vincenzo Natali.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's an independent director, and, sort of in the same vein of a lot of these independent filmmakers, they make one cheap indie movie that's a hit, and then makes a bunch of junk, and never really regains that magic of the first film. Right now, he made Splice. I don't know if you saw that weird movie with, Adrian Brody.
No, I didn't see it. It violated my, it just looked like a standard, science is evil. We shouldn't do any genetic engineering. It's going to create a monster kind of. I mean, just this standard old Frankenstein kind of thing. It
is certainly that. Also, don't have sex with your research. That's the other lesson of that movie. And now he's slated to make Neuromancer. But hasn't someone been slated to make Neuromancer since 1985?
Probably. Yeah, I mean, I don't see it on his IMDb thing here. Is that just a rumor maybe at this point? Or
it could be. It's on Wikipedia.
So. Oh,
it's on the Wikipedia.
I hope it's just a rumor, because surely they could do better than him to get someone to direct Neuromancer.
Well, let's talk about some weird, like, actual sort of outer space science fiction kinds of movies. You guys seen Ice Pirates? Anyone?
No, I know the movie, but I haven't seen it. I actually discovered it while I was researching Space Pirates in Space. Because it was this sort of like swashbuckling sci-fi comedy thing. There were some parallels, but I actually have never seen the movie.
All right, this is a movie. I just loved this movie as a kid. It's the premise is that there's been an interstellar war and all the Earth-like planets have been blown up, and so water has become a scarce commodity, and so the only way to go water is to go to some frozen planet and cut out big blocks of ice, and transport them back to civilization. So of course there are ice pirates who have their who swoop in with their ships and steal the ice, which I think is a great premise. But there's all sorts of weird shit in this movie. Like at one point their ship is infested with monsters called space herpes. But the sort of climactic battle is they're going through a hyperspace wormhole or something, and so time is going really fast, and so the characters are aging at the rate of 1 day per minute or something, and so they're growing these huge long beards, and they're becoming senile and decrepit as they're fighting, and all sorts of just crazy stuff happens in this movie. And that, I guess, I know someone who is related to the person who wrote it, and I guess he was pretty unhappy that they took his script and turned it into this really, really campy, weird thing. But I definitely recommend that. I don't know if it's as good as it was when I was 12, but
I'm sure it's as good.
I mean, just how many really weird outer space movies are there like that? Yeah. You can't be picky. Can't be that picky.
Actually, it's not in outer space, obviously, but I mean, just when you mentioned seeing it when you were 12, that just reminded me of The Dark Crystal, which I tried to rewatch as an adult, and it was like, holy crap, what a weird movie that is. That is like a bizarre film, and I can't believe that like it became like the iconic thing that it is, because like, I mean, people remember it so fondly, and it's like, I tried to rewatch it as an adult, and I was like, I do not know what the hell anyone sees in this thing. It's like, I was baffled by it.
Well, but I think back in the 80s, there were so few fantasy type things that like even like Legend or like anything fantasy, or like, wow, it's a fantasy movie. This is so exciting. And
John, I'm so sad to hear that you don't like Dark Crystal. I find that movie so magical. Just because, originally they wanted to do the entire film in made-up languages. Have no comprehensible dialogue.
Yeah.
And just let it be this eye and ear candy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a cool idea that, you could take a film that has, obviously, no actors and no animation and just tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It was so fresh and original.
Wait, would they have subtitles, or you just wouldn't know what the people were saying at all?
I don't know. But that was sort of the dream that Jim Henson and Frank Oz wanted to do.
I have to say, this movie I watched last night, Kill List, it's set in the UK, and the characters have these really thick accents, and the sound isn't recorded very well, and I literally couldn't understand almost anything anybody said in the entire movie, and I still enjoyed it, so that's a proof of concept for that idea.
Dark Crystal could have worked without dialogue.
No, I mean, I don't have any trouble imagining that I could have actually enjoyed the Dark Crystal more if it was as you were describing it, just because, I know that there's a lot of times when you have a performance that is integral to the story, that it makes it a lot harder to watch if the performance isn't good. Like, for instance, I think of Star Wars, the prequels, when they had all of the aliens speaking English and they looked ridiculous, and I'm like, these scenes would be 100% better if they just were speaking in a made up language and they had subtitles, because then the performance wouldn't be a factor. And we wouldn't be looking at their stupid mouths that don't look like they're saying what they're saying at all. So, that kind of thing, sort of, factors in a lot when you have sort of weird alien creatures and fantasy creatures, I think. So.
Well, I think just anything with puppets is really weird, because puppets are just inherently creepy and weird.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. This is a pretty weird movie, I guess. There's this movie called Strings. Have you guys seen that?
Mm-mm.
Actually, that's something we should have watched at movie night. But, so Strings is this movie about puppets, or I guess technically marionettes because they have strings, right? So it's about these, marionettes, but they're living, breathing creatures, right? But they are still all connected to these strings that go up magically into the sky. And so all of their buildings and stuff have, they don't have roofs because they, so it's I don't know, I guess they just sort of have walls. I don't know. It was kind of a weird construction of their, architecture, because they had to accommodate all these wires that go up into the heavens. And so if they have a string cut, it's they could, if they had to, let's see, they could replace their limbs by just taking another limb off of a dead puppet, but they'd have to have that same string that still goes into the heavens. And there's just very, very complicated world building, and it's just very strange. So,
well, I was just going to mention the sex scene in Team America World Police. It's got to be one of the weirdest scenes of all time. Who would ever have imagined this therely explicit sex scene with puppets?
Yeah.
That scene is so epic. There's talking about weirdness. There's this amazing scene in Dark Crystal where the Gelflings are fighting with a Skeksis, and they throw him into a pit of lava, and then it cuts to the old sage-like creatures walking towards the castle, and then out of nowhere, one of them just spontaneously combusts, just foop, and he's gone. And none of the other dudes walking care. It's just so strange. And as the movie, gets to the climax, you understand what's happening in that scene. But in the moment, it's just so bizarre. Labyrinth was one of these movies that I first discovered on late night TV, and I had missed the first 15 minutes of it. So the very first scene I saw was her kind of making her first moments inside the labyrinth, which is talking to the worm, and the arrows are getting turned around. And I didn't know this movie existed. I knew nothing about it. And it was so strange trying to figure out the movie as I went along. That ambiguity, that mystery, I think added something to the experience, because it was just you were trying to puzzle it out.
The first episode of Farscape I ever watched, speaking of weird puppets, but the first episode of Farscape I ever watched was the third to last episode of season 4 or something like that. And it was actually really fascinating, because there's so much stuff that isn't explained. and your brain is going full speed trying to figure out everything. What the heck? Who are these people? What's going on? Nothing is being spoon-fed to you. And I often find that, coming into a movie or a TV series right in the middle is often more enjoyable than starting at the beginning, because you have to sort of work for it, I assume you guys saw Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one where they play chess with death.
Yes.
And then they play tic-tac-toe with death. And then they play, like, Parcheesi with death.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's such a bizarre movie. And I really love Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which is, like, it's just weird enough to be fun, And then Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, like, when I saw that, I was just like, what the F is going on in this movie? Like, okay, so in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, our heroes, travel through time and, meet different historical characters, which allows them to pass their history test. And then in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, they die, and sort of it's this journey through the afterlife, and they go to hell and heaven and stuff, and it's just so weird. And I've always wondered. I mean, I've actually heard people say that you should go back and watch that again. That it has its rewards if you're not totally just put off by how weird it is right at the start.
So Bill from those movies actually, he's now all grown up and making, he's directing movies now, and he actually has a documentary about Napster coming out.
There's been talk about a third Bill and Ted movie with them, The premise I heard was it would be like 20 years later or whatever, and they still haven't become famous and saved the world and stuff, and so they're starting to wonder what's going on.
Oh, uh-huh. Yeah, that could be fun.
And it was cool because you could bring back the George Carlin character with a younger actor, because he would actually have been born, because he was from the future. So, well, I want to do like sort of a rundown of the weirdest directors, and we've already mentioned David Lynch and Richard Kelly. Some other ones I have on my list here are Charlie Kaufman, Terry Gilliam, David Cronenberg. And you mentioned Stanley Kubrick. Matt has a note here. The furry sex in The Shining is scarier than guys getting killed with axes.
Don't you think so? That's the most unsettling moment
What's
for me.
The furry sex?
There's this scene at the end of the movie when Shelley Duvall's trying to run out of the house, where she like comes up the staircase or something, and at the top of the stairs, she looks into one of the bedrooms, and there's this old man in a tuxedo having sex with a man in a dog suit. And it's in the book, actually. There's several scenes with these two characters in the book. But it's the only instance of it appearing in the film, and it is so strange and so terrifying. It makes you feel like you fell asleep during the movie and had a nightmare. Like, about the movie. Because it's so contextually bizarre. And I find it much scarier than, the blood flying out of the elevator or the two little girls. Kubrick, I think, is a great example. You don't think about him as being like a director of the weird, but in fact, all of his movies are really bizarre. Like 2001 may be like the quintessential ambiguous movie, right? If any movie has an ending that's still debated, 40 years later, 50 years later.
Actually, and like the weirdest opening to a movie ever, it's like, oh, I know, let's start my outer space movie with like half an hour of chimps, or like, prehistoric men or whatever it was. It was
a silent 30-minute movie with chimps.
I was seriously like, I did not remember that at all. Like when I rewatched 2001, like I think I rewatched it like right after he died. And, I was like, what, I don't understand. What is this? Like, why is, like, okay, so what? This is like 5 minutes long? No, okay, so I'm fast forwarding. I'm like, what the hell? It's like 30 minutes long. It's like ridiculous. It's like, how can this much of the movie be this? It's like, couldn't this be accomplished in like one scene? It's like, I get it. Yeah. I like it when he throws the bone up and yeah, I get it. All right. Does it have to take that long? I mean, my God.
Did you guys see, oh gosh, sorry. That new movie from the guy who did The Thin Red Line?
No. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Tree of Life? Tree of Life?
Tree of Life, yeah. Did you guys see Tree of Life?
No.
So that movie opens with like the formation of the universe. And there's like 20 minutes of dinosaurs at the beginning.
Oh, awesome.
It's like so bizarre, right?
Is it Terrence Malick?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting issue like people like are they geniuses or like, I mean, you know, if you spent your whole life perfecting your craft, do you eventually get to a point where your aesthetic standards have become so divorced from ordinary people that they don't like what you're making anymore, and they're going to die before they ever get to the point where they would appreciate what you're making? And what do you do at that point, right?
Yeah. No, I think that definitely happens, yeah.
There's a really interesting analysis that you can find on YouTube of the climactic shootout in Full Metal Jacket, where he breaks so many like film 101 rules in that scene. It is rife with continuity errors. It's just a complete mess. And yet no one notices when you watch the movie because it's so visceral and intense. And what this video breaks down is like he's embedding secrets and stuff inside the mistakes. Like the guy who produced this video claims that it's like this strange metaphor for the JFK assassination, and that you have to have the continuity mistakes to make it work. That all of the errors that Kubrick made in that scene were totally deliberate. There's a similar video about The Shining and how the set was designed in a way that is deliberately impossible to exist. Like, you walk into an interior office that you know is in the center of the hotel with walls on all four sides. But you go inside the office and you can see a window facing out onto a sunny day. Or like you go down a hallway and you see that there's no rooms on one side. It's like an open lobby. But then the wall that sort of separates the open lobby from the hallway, there's all of these room doors. And you don't notice any of these mistakes, if they're really mistakes, as you're watching the film. But as you watch it, you start to feel this sense of unease, and you're not sure why. And it's because your sense of direction is being messed with through his camera work and his set design. So, I mean, in the case of Kubrick, at least, I mean, he's a mad genius. He knows how to point a camera. He knows how to craft a set as to not break continuity. But he breaks it anyway in these specific instances when it's supposed to make the audience feel a particular way, without them even realizing that that's the way they're feeling, or that's why they're feeling it.
All right, yeah, so we're running a little short on time here, but we do want to talk a little bit more about, at least cover briefly, Charlie Kaufman, Terry Gilliam, and David Cronenberg. I don't know, how about you guys? What movies are there that stick out in your minds the most?
I mean, well, you know, Charlie Kaufman, I mean, I think his first movie was Being John Malkovich, and look, I mean, and I mean, what a bizarre movie that is.
I think that movie's really great. I mean, he gets away with just making the most bizarre, whimsical films that just seem totally illogical. But, you know, he also kind of has a method to his randomness, to his whimsy. He did a really interesting interview with Rolling Stone a few years ago, back when Schenectady, New York was coming out. And there's actually audio of the unedited interview. It's like an hour and a half long. It's really great. You guys should watch it because he talks about everything in his career, from Being John Malkovich and even the work, like the sitcom work that he did before that in the 90s, all the way up until, you know, the stuff that he's working on these days. He tells this great story about a dream he had that he would create a hotel on the Las Vegas Strip called Las Vegas, Las Vegas. And the hotel itself was an exact replica of the Las Vegas Strip. And if you got to the point in the hotel where you reached Las Vegas, Las Vegas, there would be another entire Las Vegas Strip inside that miniature hotel. And then it's turtles all the way down.
And how about Terry Gilliam? What sticks out for you guys from Terry Gilliam?
I mean, for me, my favorite movie of his by far is 12 Monkeys. I mean, that's just one of my favorite movies ever, but that's nowhere near his weirdest movie, I wouldn't say. I mean, maybe Time Bandits is would you say that's his weirdest? I mean, almost all of his work is just really, really strange. And I mean, even 12 Monkeys does have its own strange moments, but...
I've always been partial to his animation. just because that, like, we were talking before about, like, condensing weirdness to a smaller element, whether it be like a 75-minute movie instead of a 2-hour movie, or a short story instead of a novel. But I think that, like, when he does those 30, 90-second animations for Monty Python, and it's just like, the Eiffel Tower coming out of the Queen's butt, and these weird teacups with spider legs, and it's so strange. And it ends up being these images that you can't get out of your head, even if, the whole thing that you saw is only 30 seconds long.
There's this great documentary called Lost in La Mancha, where it's about a very ill-fated attempt by Terry Gilliam to film a Don Quixote movie, a sort of time travel Don Quixote movie with Johnny Depp as a modern man who ends up in the role of Sancho Panza. And like everything you could possibly imagine going wrong on a film shoot goes wrong, including the entire, like, all the equipment being washed away in a flood on, like, day 2 of the filming.
There's a great behind-the-scenes documentary of 12 Monkeys that was directed by the same guys who did Lost in La Mancha. And apparently the story was that they were, these guys were way overqualified to do a behind-the-scenes featurette. But they were on set for 12 Monkeys, assuming that Terry Gilliam was going to screw up and fail to actually make the movie. Because they knew that he'd had this track record of being really inconsistent, either producing something incredible for no money, or some huge bloated production like Baron Munchausen and having it tank at the box office. So these documentary filmmakers were on set for both 12 Monkeys and the Don Quixote movie, with the expectation that he would eventually screw up and fail to produce a film.
I mean, there was a big potential disaster with 12 Monkeys. I don't know if you guys know this, but there was this artist, and he painted this sort of science fictional scene of this chair. And I guess somebody, I don't know, Terry Gilliam or somebody on the production staff was like, that's a really cool scene. We should use that in the movie. And they did the shot where Bruce Willis is being interrogated by the people in the future to look exactly like this painting. And then somehow the artist found out about it and sued them, like right before it was supposed to be released. And somehow they made a deal with the artist, and the movie was released. But yeah, I guess there are these sort of disastrous things happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's so funny. That reminds me of the relationship between the movies of Darren Aronofsky and this anime film called Perfect Blue. It's a weird psychological thriller about a pop star who tries to become a serious actress, but sort of, maybe she's insane, maybe she's being hunted by someone. You can't really know for sure. But there are scenes in Perfect Blue that are lifted, shot for shot, beat for beat, in both Black Swan and Requiem for a Dream. He reuses scenes from this movie all the time. And he's credited the director of the film, before, because, he treats him as an inspiration. But it's funny to see how these weird directors, the directors of psychological thrillers, sort of, borrow from each other and use some of these same strange tropes.
Terry Gilliam reminds me of another director I want to mention, at least in passing. He's a French director named Jean-Pierre Jeunet, and he directed like Delicatessen and City of Lost Children. And those are the two weird ones that I was thinking of. He also later directed Amelie and A Very Long Engagement, which were also sort of fantasy films, but they're less weird. But
Amelie's pretty weird.
It's pretty weird, yeah. But not in the way that City of Lost Children or Delicatessen is weird.
That's certainly true.
Those two are bizarre, and Amelie is just like sort of pleasantly weird. It's like it's a very light weird compared to those other ones. So, but yeah, I think if we're going to be talking about weird filmmakers, we definitely have to at least mention this guy. And we don't have to mention that horrible science fiction movie that he made that was an abomination.
You mean Alien 4?
Why'd you say it?
Delicatessen falls into a category of film that I love called, I call them 2 to 4 movies. They're movies that you have to watch between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m.
Uh-huh.
It's the only time you want to watch a movie like that because it's so strange and your brain's like not working at top speed. And so it completely blows your mind. Another one, kind of similar, is, in actually quite a few ways, is this movie Ravenous. It's a movie about cannibals in the Old West. It stars Guy Pearce and Robert Carlyle, and like David Arquette is in it. It's the weirdest movie. But they're like at an Old West fort. And there's like Wendigo mythos. It's very cool. But only because I watched it between 2 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning.
Is there such a thing as 4 to 6 movies, or
4 to 6 movies? Those are the ones that are really strange. Actually, there was there was one night where when I was a kid, I had a friend who was like super rich, and his parents would just like buy pay-per-view channels and just let them run 24 hours a day, like it was cable.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would hang out in his brother's room where the TV was on. His brother had gone out on a date or something. And I was terrified to touch anything in his brother's room. I was scared to death of this guy. So he would like leave his TV on when he went out of the house, which is a phenomenon I've never been able to understand, but I know that people do it. So I'd go into his brother's room and the TV would be on some pay-per-view channel, and I'd be terrified to turn it off or change the channel. And so one night, Interview with the Vampire was on 3 times in a row. And so I ended up watching the movie from midnight to 2 to 4, and then again from 4 to 6. And it got weirder every single time. So I assume there is some, there is something to be said for the 4 to 6 movie. But maybe Kill List is the kind of movie that you want to watch from 4 to 6 in the morning.
All right, so David Cronenberg. What do you guys think about David Cronenberg?
Yeah, boy, I mean, where do you even begin with him as far as, like, what his weirdest movie might be? I mean, like, from Scanners, to Videodrome, I mean, The Fly. I mean, there's a bunch of these I haven't even seen that I'm sure they're on par, but, I mean, Existence was a really weird one, too. I think that may have actually been the first movie of his I saw, but, I mean, he actually has done some movies that aren't that weird. Like, I mean, History of Violence wasn't that weird, but...
I actually think that History of Violence is really strange. And that's a sign of Cronenberg being one of the ultimate weird directors. Because even a movie that's not supposed to be very strange is totally bizarre. There's that freaky sex scene in the middle of the movie where they like tear each other's clothes off on the stairs. And then the whole third act is like this weird mob shootout in that house where like I couldn't tell which way was up. I didn't get a sense of geography. I didn't know who any of these characters are. It was very strange. And that was supposed to be one of his more standard linear films.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's this scene where Viggo Mortensen sort of punches the mob guy in the face, and his face is just destroyed. I mean, he looks like he got hit with a chainsaw or something. And that's a characteristic of Cronenberg, right? Is the body horror thing that there's all sorts of gross that's his trademark, is the gross biological stuff, sometimes combined with gross technological stuff.
Yeah. Oh man, Crash. Oh, that was the extent of my commentary on Crash.
And it's funny too how that in Scanners, where the guy's head explodes, that's become a meme. And sometimes, when somebody said something really deep or profound or something, somebody will just post "whoa," and it's just just like that gif of that head exploding scene. All right, cool. So I think we're going to start wrapping up this segment. And we didn't even get a chance to talk about video games. So maybe we'll come back and do that some other time again. But before we let you go, Matt, we did want to talk to you a little bit about space pirates in space and just find out how that's been going. Why don't you just tell people what is the premise of Space Pirates in Space?
So Space Pirates in Space is an animated web series about a team of incompetent space pirates who sail the 7 galaxies, robbing the cosmos one screw up at a time. So we have Captain Arth, who's sort of delusional, but thinks that he's a really great pirate. His long-suffering pilot, Jamie, who's sort of the anchor of the show. And then they're sort of surrounded by a bunch of quirky supporting characters like Goop, who's a 10-foot-tall walking jello mold, Simon, who's a lecherous teenage computer programmer, and Sergeant Abe Manchego, a mercenary cyborg who's constantly getting his limbs blown off.
You're actually, I mean, you have a voice cast, right? But you're doing all the animation yourself, right? Or is anyone helping you with it?
Right. So my producer, Paul Kite, who plays the voice of Goop on the show, helps me with some of the asset building. So, like, he'll draw some of the backgrounds and some of the props that the characters use on the show. But I designed all the characters and do all the animating myself. I sort of use this style that's kind of like halfway in between, like an actual animation and like a comic. So there's lots of camera movement and a sense of three-dimensionality in the frame, but you sort of have these kind of static-looking shots, so it almost feels more like an ongoing web comic rather than a web series, which is great, I think, because, you know, people want like really bite-sized content anyway. And Space Pirates, you know, each episode of Space Pirates is only 30 to 60 seconds long. So you can watch a bunch of them like popcorn, one, you know, yum, 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 like that.
And I mean, the characters, they kind of look like 8-bit art, like video game art. So it's this very sort of simple art, but then the animation and some of the camera moves look very smooth and very sophisticated. I mean, how do you, what kind of software are you using to do that kind of effect? So
I use Photoshop to draw the actual characters and then animate the 2D sprites in After Effects. So it's cool because the characters themselves are drawn in this sort of 8-bit old school video game kind of way. I was really inspired by video game art growing up. I was a huge fan of Final Fantasy. And this was kind of a spoof on those kinds of characters. You know, the team of heroes that go on a long quest. But here they're, you know, criminals and bumbling idiots. So it's After Effects that allows me to give the show its kind of signature style, which is two-dimensional characters in a three-dimensional environment. In fact, you know, there are moments where the characters will turn to the side and you'll actually see that they are two-dimensional. So I'll spoil a big joke now, but something I'm really hoping to do on the show is at one point have someone discover like the second dimension and they're able to actually see someone in profile and it completely blows their minds, like they've seen, you know, a galaxy explode.
Well, it should be the third dimension, right?
Oh, right, the third dimension.
And it was cool. You had this premiere for it where, actually, why don't you just talk about the premiere? That was cool.
Sure. So we had a world premiere where we screened the entire first season of Space Pirates in Space. A lot of the cast was there, a lot of the crew. We ended up with about 60 people, I think, showed up. And we screened it at a private outdoor movie theater in Brooklyn. I'd actually helped to build the theater, which is into someone's, you know, backyard. But we had painted this huge brick wall with non-reflective white paint, and then we actually projected the movie onto the wall. And it turned out really great. We actually had people hanging out of windows from neighboring buildings to sort of like watch the movie as it was going.
And what kind of feedback have you gotten on it so far?
Everyone who watches it totally freaks out and loves it. The biggest challenge we've had is just getting the word out there that the show exists, you know? And, but everyone who's seen it is just like, oh my God, I've always wanted to watch a show like this, or this reminds me of shows that I really love, like Archer, or Venture Brothers, South Park. Those are some of the shows that inspired us, and so it's really great to hear those comparisons.
And so if people want to watch it, they just go to spacepiratesinSpace.com. Is there anything else they need to know?
Yeah, you can go to spacepiratesinSpace.com, watch the entire series there. You can find us in YouTube, Space Pirates, and subscribe to Space Pirates in Space. And you can follow us on Twitter at SpacePiratesX.
All right, cool. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks again to Nalo Hopkinson for being our guest today. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes lately, including Laura RK and Arky123456. Laura RK writes, I discovered this podcast about 2 months ago, and I listened to more than 3/4 of them, and they are amazing. I live in a smallish town, and when my geek friends moved out of state, I have felt high and dry. But this podcast has brought the geek back with a vengeance. Thanks for making me feel normal-ish, and shining a light on authors and other podcasts I never heard about. I have to say that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is one of the best produced and most interesting. Thank you for your hard work, dedication, and geekiness. So thank you, Laura R.K. And now it's time to announce the winners of the free book giveaway that we described at the end of our last episode. 5 lucky listeners were selected at random to receive a free copy of the anthology Oz Reimagined, New Tales from the Emerald City and Beyond, edited by John Joseph Adams and Douglas Cohen. And the winners are Scott Kreidler, a.k.a. S.K. Rydell, Andy Michaels, a.k.a. Stop That Andy, Philip Kirby, a.k.a. Fat Jitsu, Juan San Miguel, a.k.a. Rainbow War 71, and Ernie Satyricos, a.k.a. Satyricos. So congratulations to the winners. If you're one of them, please send your mailing address to us at geeksgalaxy@gmail.com, and we'll mail you a free copy of Oz Reimagined. And big thanks to everyone who entered. Alright, so that was our show. Thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.